Hello and welcome to the second part of the discussion about rhythm that we're having for music 3. So this is rhythm part 2. So I mentioned in the last one, uh, I'd show you what an old-fashioned metronome looks like. The last thing I talked about was those um, Italian tempo terms, which were kind of stand-ins for having exact um, metronome markings, beat per minute markings. Now you might ask, well, they had metronomes. Why couldn't they, just put a number down? 80 beats per minute, 60 beats per minute. A clock is 60 beats per minute. Well, now, granted, this is an antique, but this will just give you an idea of why people may not have preferred to use these types of metronomes until they were improved, the design. So the way it operates is you have a little weight, and depending on where you place it, and I'll put a picture in the course materials so you can see that close up that the tempos listed here. If I want it presto or allegro or andante or adagio or larghetto or largo, I can just move this piece on the arm. So if I want it slow, well, now it's not moving at all. But here, there's a little asymmetry. And then if I want it to go faster, but you can hear how both beats aren't the same. So that's kind of a reason why the technology demanded that other ways of keeping time also be available for you. So continuing on our discussion, we're going to talk a little bit about terms that have to do with timekeeping and rhythm when there is something occurring in the music that's other than regular pulse, right? So what we did during your first year of music was very largely dependent upon having a constant, unchanging pulse. But of course, music doesn't work that way all the time. There's variety. And so there are some terms to use depending on how the rhythm or the time is behaving. And so so far, we listened to Sleep by Eric Whitacre. We listened to the Chopin Nocturne. And you could sense that the rhythm has sort of an accordion quality in some ways, but it has breath to it. So much like the way some choreography is coordinated by just breathing and kind of using a little bit more natural and less scientific and symmetrical means, you can still coordinate really nicely. What ends up happening in music that has a little bit more what we can call expressive rhythm? What ends up happening is that the tempo is related to the tension of the moment. And I'll use a movie metaphor here. At the climax of a really important moment in a movie, when there's a lot of tension and you don't know which way it's going to go, the movie doesn't speed up, it slows down, right? And when there's more tension in music, especially harmonically, and we'll talk about harmony later in the course, when there's more tension, though, that's a moment to kind of bathe in that discomfort and kind of stretch out the moment. Likewise, if I want to make an important point, I slow down when I'm trying to say it. But if I don't care what you're listening to, I'll just talk fast and go right past it, right? It's so the pacing has everything to do with what type of message you're trying to deliver. This sort of rubber band, the underpinning of the tempo, like, there's tension and there's release. It definitely just rhythmically gives music more emotional quality before we're talking about any of the other ingredients of it. Um, and because we've all had experience with percussion and drums, you might imagine that music with this quality doesn't gravitate towards instruments that have a strong attack waveform. If you were to put it in a music editing program and you saw the graph of all the waves, the sharper those waves are, the less likely that that sound would be fitting for these moments of push and pull when you have um, an irregular tempo. And now there's a couple types of irregular tempo. They kind of go according to degree and how predictable things are going to end up being. So, free rhythm is our least predictable type of approach to rhythm. We've listened to, or you will listen to again, the Japanese shakuhachi flute music, where you could almost make the comparison to the tempo of speaking, conversational speaking, um, organic rhythm, where you're not, um, there's no rush. The only thing that's determining when things are happening is when it feels right for them to happen, right? You're not on the clock, that sort of thing. It's more spontaneous because it's not having to abide by some sort of rule, timing rule or meter. Very often, this type of music, as a result, is very difficult to write down because how do you indicate without pushing too far in one direction, fast direction or slow direction, how things are supposed to go? Western music attempts this in some ways by removing most of the notes, the aspects of the notes that indicate rhythms. Like it'll remove stems, and everything will turn into just a whole note. And then your or a regular note head, like a regular black note head. So picture music, any kind of sheet music, but where all the vertical and horizontal lines are gone, right? Those are all the things that tell you when to do things. And as soon as you remove that, well, then it has a lot more to do with your choice to do it. So the question is, and I'm assuming at this point everybody's listened to the shakuhachi recording, but how would you coordinate with that recording, that particular recording, versus how would you coordinate with a live musician playing that same piece? Now, the implication there is, of course, that the live musician's not going to be exactly the same every time. And when would you want to do one versus the other? Those are some questions and some problems that you would want to be able to solve so that you could have an effective rehearsal, so that you could create and have a consistent or predictable product that you're putting together, a result from all your work. But so with the recording, you can either, as one of the students in the class put it, once upon a time, you could either really go with it or really ignore the nature of the music. So you could use every note and every silence in particular. The silences are very useful. They're basically in place of the beginning of an 8 count. The silence can be count 1, right? Because regardless of anything else, anybody can pick out when there's no sound. Silence is a very effective communication tool. As a matter of fact, as an accompanist, when I'm working in a class and I see that there's a loss of clarity as to where a phrase begins or where a meter ends, or where an accent is supposed to go, one of the best devices that I'll use is silence. I will remove my sound entirely, and therefore whatever comes after that becomes more important. So with the recording, we can use those silences because they're predictable. With a live musician, well, we're still going to have those silences, but we also have the advantage of visual communication. dancers cue musician, musician cues dancers. There's that level of interplay that then becomes possible. And so, really, if we're talking about timing and whether something is right or wrong, as long as everybody's able to anticipate it, it's right. And if it's unpredictable and you don't know if you're going to be able to fully coordinate with the music or the other dancers, then it's not right, right? So it's not. We're not saying that regular metric rhythm is the best rhythm. I think you understand. I'm not saying that, um, but we're talking about there are plenty of easy ways to coordinate with music, even if it doesn't have a regular count structure to it. And especially when you're talking about being consistent with a given composition. There is, in some cases, a lot of tendency towards soundscapes rather than more through composed scores that in some ways resemble musical wallpaper. They're just something that's kind of politely sitting in the background, and it doesn't work. There are no cues needed, and there is a use for music like that for sure. But what percentage of the work that you do is going to be with that sort of music, right? Maybe a lot, maybe almost none, depending on the type of work you're going into, or whether you plan on teaching or choreographing or being you know, a light designer, like any number of things. A lot of what you do is going to need to be coordinatable, um, especially as you get more into the commercial end of things. For those of you who end up doing things in that vein, when we listen to the Chopin, moving on now, different concepts. So that was free rhythm, the shakuhachi, basically the organic, spontaneous. And now we're getting a little bit more restrictive, but still giving the player or the musician some latitude as to when the rhythms unfold and how long a beat is, because we're still talking about the idea of not all beats, quote unquote, are the same length. And again, if this doesn't make sense, go back and listen to the music and try and conduct along with it. The 4 pattern that we went over in the last video, so that this is not just just an abstract definition that you write down because there might be a test on it, but that it's an applicable concept so that you can identify it. So the rubato is the next thing, and this is the term when we listen to the Chopin, the term that was defined as robbed, as in you're taking time away. So what does that mean? Well, if I want to get somewhere early, that means I accordingly will then have to get somewhere late. That's a way, if we're talking about travel, that's kind of what we mean with respect to taking and giving back. So another way of putting it is that if you have successive peaks in a roller coaster, as the roller coaster train, I don't know if that's what they're called, or the cars, the thing you're sitting in, right? As it's getting faster, it approaches a certain point and then it starts to slow down as it goes back up, right? So the speed at which it's traveling along the track is not constant. The rate of speed is not constant, but yet from hilltop or the peak to the next peak and the peak after that, you can measure that time and it can be pretty predictable. So the idea is that at larger scales, we're still being pretty accurate with keeping time, but the in between, the micromanaging, isn't happening. And so on a small scale, you can still be very expressive. So let's say I put on my trusty metronome, and if I wanted to play really, really accurate rhythm, I would put quarter notes on it. But if I want to give myself freedom, all I'm doing is clapping once every 4 counts that I was doing in that previous tempo. And therefore, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. I can stretch, I can push, I can do different things, but as long as I'm hitting that main reference point at the next big beat, that's fine. It's a way to coordinate again without being rigid. So this is a little bit more rigid than free rhythm, but we're not quite perfectly metric yet. Then we have the issue of interruption of tempo. Time, it's we're on this continuum of, okay, very free, a little less free, least free. But what about pauses, right? Well, there is the concept of the fermata. And I'll put a picture in the course materials so you can see what it looks like. It looks kind of like an eye. In Italy, it's called a corona, but fermata is the term that, for example, when you listen to the very opening of the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, bum 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 bum, bum 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 bum, we're going to listen to a few different versions of that, so you get a sense of, well, in that case, that long note has what's called a fermata over it, which means that for the time being, we're freezing. Time is standing still. And then we can elect when to continue on. Fermatas can apply to notes, they can apply to rests, right? So there can be an open period of silence, or there can be an open period of sound. But either way, it's a way to refer to a moment in music that is otherwise metric. So here's your use of this. It's a way to refer to a moment in music that is otherwise predictable in its timing, that has a temporary moment where there is no discernible meter going on. And especially if we're talking about live musicians, where the next moment will require some sort of coordinated entrance. So generally a fermata is, if we're talking about like in an orchestra, a fermata is the one moment where the orchestra really needs that conductor. There are some arguments that, in some groups that don't use a conductor at all. Because if you think about it, if everybody has a good enough sense of timing, why do we need somebody up there keeping track? I can read my music. I know this. I know how this piece of music goes. I know how this song goes, whichever one we're doing at the time. Why do I need a conductor? Well, what happens when things get less regular? And coming out of a fermata, coming out of a moment where time has ceased, is where it becomes useful to have someone to cue and to reinitiate the time. So we're going to listen to a couple versions of that opening statement of the Beethoven Symphony. We're not going to listen to the whole thing, but just that, because it's so iconic, it's kind of interesting to get some different takes on how long different musicians felt that moment should last, right? And the fermata allows them to do that. Useful terms. So now we're getting into the world of regular metered music, again, regular tempo music. But these are terms that for lack of a better term, using the word term too many times, for lack of a better word, or a better place to talk about these, I wanted to put them in somewhere, because these are words that don't quite get used consistently enough. There can sometimes be a vague understanding of what they mean, or an incorrect understanding of what they mean. Separate example that doesn't have to do with rhythm, but is a musical term that gets borrowed. I heard it on the news today. The word crescendo. Crescendo means to build. right? But a lot of times people accidentally use it to mean the peak of that build, right? Um, and whether it's just simply to communicate effectively and accurately, or so that you sound like you know what you're talking about, it's good to be able to hear these words and to get a slightly better idea, at least slightly better idea of what you are going to be able to convey, what thoughts these words convey. So, first word, downbeat. Well, we talked about that when we conduct, right? Down. Downbeat refers to, it's got a few different definitions. Any of these are worthy, but it can refer to beat one. So beat one of a measure or beat one of an 8 count. It can refer to the quarter note, the numbers within the beat. So if you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, there are 4 downbeats. That's another context, right? So that's slightly less special. It's referring to more things, but you can still call them the downbeats, especially when we're contrasting them with upbeats, which we'll get to in a second. And then downbeat is there might come a time where you come across this usage, but musicians will occasionally use the term downbeat to refer to when the beginning of something is, like a rehearsal or a concert. Hey, when's the downbeat? Oh, it's at 1 p.m. Okay, so I know concert starts at 1 p.m. That's the sort of thing. That's a little bit of slang, but in general, downbeat refers to beat one and the beats where you're tapping your foot, right? Those parts. Upbeat. Normally, upbeat means the and counts, right? And for and right. That puts some upbeats in between my sounds, right? Those are upbeat. Obviously, can be used in a different adjective sort of way or descriptive sort of way to indicate that things are light and cheerful. But when we're talking about rhythm, we're talking about the and counts, and we can also upbeat can be describing a fast tempo, right? So those are the usages, but mostly it means the moments or the halfway point between downbeats. We got down, up, down, up, and we have upbeats, downbeats, down, up, down, up, down, up, like that. Next term, backbeat. And I wrote a pretty thorough article on why some people clap on 1 and 3 and some people clap on 2 and 4. Well, that has to do with backbeats. And when you're playing or listening to music that's in 4/4 and it's got any kind of version of heavy, low, high, boom, tap, any version of that, even if it's slower or faster, the 2 and 4, the high sound, the snare drum on the drum set is generally going to be the instrument that's playing a backbeat. The 2 and 4, boom, boom, got, boom, boom, got. We Will Rock You. The claps are the backbeats, right? The high sound. The stomps are the low sound. Clap is the high sound. And if not all types of music that are in 4 have backbeats, but a lot of times if you want to make music sound like it's going in a popular style as opposed to a classical beat behind it. There was a trend in the 1970s, speaking of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, there was a song called A Fifth of Beethoven, right? So there's the alcoholic implication. Fifth of Beethoven, where it was a disco beat with upbeats in the drum part, and they added a backbeat. Boom, right? So all of a sudden, we're shifting styles by adding that backbeat in. So downbeat, upbeat, backbeat. With backbeat, check out the article that I wrote about that for a little bit more of a fleshed out concept of, for example, why it sounds good or not so good to clap on 1 and 3 in music. And there is an example that I will provide a link, and then we can watch together, if they're time permitting, is where a pianist, a jazz pianist, had he was in a European television studio playing for a live studio audience, and the audience was getting to it, and they started clapping on 1 and 3, and him and his band they couldn't handle it, so he ended up altering the music in a way so that the audience, without knowing it, started clapping on 2 and 4 instead. And it's a pretty clever thing. So we'll check that out together. But that's how important the backbeat versus the 1 and 3, right? And you'll read that article, so you'll get a little more context for that. But that's how important that is to the style of music, that rhythmic ingredient right there. More terms. And again, these are terms where you're going to hear them in some context or another. And I at least want you privately to go, all right, I know what that means. If not, to be able to apply these terms when you need them, right? Those are the two circumstances I would like you to feel prepared for. So we have the term syncopation. Syncopation is accenting the weaker parts of the meter. And I'm going to put a couple links to a couple different types of syncopation. It can be light or it can be heavy. And so music that accents more upbeats than downbeats, right? Upbeats are not as strong because they're not our reference points, right? We're not assigning numbers to them. We're not tapping our foot on them most of the time. They're considered the in-between points, and they're less important in general. And so whenever you have emphasis of things that are in between the beats, avoiding beat 1, right? Syncopation generally is another way of making rhythm elusive, right? Now there are different types of syncopation, but it can be in general on a spectrum, right? It can be light or it can be heavy, and there's some brief listening examples that I want you to check out on your own, again, so that you can hear what I'm talking about rather than just hearing my words. I want you to hear a context for it. Another term, swing. This is a term I know that you're aware of. So in music, swing is not really perfectly definable. If we're to be really thorough about talking about what it is, but it is basically making the rhythm bouncy. It's not perfectly writable. Swing rhythm refers to taking, for example, what was rather straight eighth notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and I'll go a little faster. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So I'm taking these eighth notes and I'm going to swing them. And so that's the first thing that musicians mean when they're talking about swing. You're taking the note that's on the beat, making it a little longer, the note that's on the upbeat, making it a little later, right? So instead of 1 and, we get 1 triplet, right? Swing can be represented by using a triplet underlying pulse, right? Don't worry too much about that. It's just basically saying instead of the halfway point, we're going past the halfway point for our upbeat. Right? We're delaying the second note, right? To just get really into it. And again, it's 1 and 2 and versus 1, 2, right? So you can hear where I'm taking the and counts and I'm pushing them over. Sing, Sing, Sing. Well, the full name of that song is Sing, Sing, Sing with a Swing, right? And if you listen to the original Louis Prima version, you hear those lyrics. but that is a great example of swing. And when that music is written down, very often the people writing it know that they can't write out exactly how the swing rhythm goes. So they will indicate, hey, this is supposed to be played in a swing style. And so the musicians have to bring that to the piece because it's not written out precisely exactly how that swing operates in the music. Now, we're going to contrast this with swing in the dance sense as I've been exposed to it. Um, as I've seen it in modern technique classes, Limon classes, where there's like, I wrote down a good note here: a quality of release and the use of gravity to accelerate and slow down, so that we have this churn, right? A little bit of speeding up, slowing down. So on a micro scale, it's almost like that roller coaster thing I talked about, right? We're not going at a constant rate. We're dropping, recovering, dropping, recovering. And I have actually found that playing a swing musical rhythm to swing movement does actually complement it nicely, because you get this sense of turnover, or that's what I would like to impart as a musician when I'm playing in those circumstances. But there is not necessarily otherwise a crossover between swing rhythm and swing movement qualities, but they can be combined with to great effect. Another term, polyrhythm. Polyrhythm, well, the prefix poly means many. Rhythm means, we already talked about what rhythm means. The simultaneous sounding of multiple rhythmic patterns. So in one sense, we can have, for example, you can have a polyrhythm of 2 against 3, where the 2 and the 3 are happening over the period of the same period of time. And there's going to be a piece of music we listen to. It's actually, maybe we'll actually watch as well, that has dance elements to it. It's a South African cultural group that they are doing, performing a dance with a song for a couple minutes, and it seems like it's in 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then at a certain point, it starts 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So you can hear an alternative tempo happening at the same time. So here's a way that you can kind of get into that and understand it. So I want you to take the following words: hot cup of tea, right? And I want you to repeat it a few times. Right? Hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea. Now, if I take hot cup tea, I would have 3 pulses per phrase, right? Hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea. If I hit hot O, then I'm actually chopping that same amount of time into 2 pieces. Hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea. So this is just a kind of a fun little device to get that the sense of polyrhythm going. Now, in a classroom full of people, we can actually put this together and have everybody say that phrase continuously, and then pick which ones they're going to clap on. But we'll try this right now. So I'm going to go 8 times with hot cup tea, and then 8 times with hot cup of tea. And what I would like you to do is do the opposite of me, right? So I want you to start with hot cup of tea, hot cup of tea, and then go to hot cup tea. And the idea is that we're going to both be saying the same thing at the same time, but we're going to be able to shift how many pulses we feel within each span of time. And the idea is, well, is this in two or is it in three? The answer is yes. It can be perceived in both ways. And I'm not being, I mean, it's kind of a silly sounding answer, but there's a lot of folkloric Afro-Cuban music and music that never had to bother being written down, where the music could be felt either way. So the idea of polyrhythm is that you can actually engage with the music and find multiple tempos that work perfectly fine within the same music, within the same music. So let's try that. So I'm going to do 8 of each, and you do the opposite ones. Here we go. Oh, one, ready, go. Hot cup of tea, 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 hot cup of switch, hot cup of tea, 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 hot. Right? After a while, the words don't mean anything. It's just syllables coming out of your mouth, but it's a way to attach, or be able to find significant points within a given repetitive rhythm. Now, that was an example of a rhythmic device that it was very, very common in African music and therefore African diaspora music, so Afro-Cuban music, and then as well as certain types of jazz that came to this country, and as the rhythm kind of went through different permutations in different generations, you get those rhythmic approaches coming up in different ways in popular music. So one of the interesting things, just a little bit of background. So there were a lot of back before. I'm going to go back a little bit of European history just to talk about why rhythm is the way it is in music of Western culture. During the Protestant Reformation, or before the Protestant Reformation, before Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther, the original guy nailed the treatise to the door. I believe that's the right word. So he the music was written music within the Catholic Church was getting very ornate. It was a sign of how much you could honor God by composing music that was very complex. And so you had music that had, complex rhythm, really, really highly coordinated, and thought out in its own way. And then along comes the Protestant Reformation with the idea that that's inappropriate. It is, you're showing off basically, and that we need to scale things back. We want things to be simple. Well, it makes it obviously more accessible for most people, for starters, but we want to be humble in the eyes of God. So rather than writing music that was very complicated and where the composer was, almost seeking attention, the performers were seeking attention. No, we want to simplify. And so music became a lot more simple in a lot of ways, but especially rhythmically. And so that kind of set what became concert music in this country back a little bit, because we were kind of thrown back into whole notes and half notes, veritably speaking, when there are other countries and cultures around the world who had a lot more variety. And maybe it was because the music, was being written down. That it certainly makes it easier to write something down if you're writing something simple. But it also had to do with the significance. What is that complexity? How is that being perceived by the culture? Um, is it ostentatious? Is it showing off? Is it braggadocio? Or are you being a humble servant? That sort of contrasting approach. So fast forward, music in this country, popular music, and just folk music in general, did not have the same sort of rhythmic uh, underpinnings that music from a lot of other cultures had. Um, and then you gradually, as you get more of the African diaspora influence in popular music, you start to get more rhythmic interest generated. And so there's if you've ever heard of the funk and soul artist James Brown, Godfather of Soul was his nickname. I think he passed away in 2005. Um, so not terribly long ago, but uh, his idea was that he wanted to treat every instrument in the band like a drum. So if you listen to "I Feel Good," for example, you listen to um, "Funky Drummer," you listen to these songs with that in mind, including the vocalist, treating all those instruments like a drummer, and then thinking about what drums are capable of in, for example, West African or African cultures. Then it becomes a really interesting way to create uh, a different approach to music. So now, then we come upon the advent of hip hop music. And so, if you've ever heard the song "Rapper's Delight," we'll listen to it separately. Um, but that came out in 1979, I believe. And the number one song of that year was a song called "My Sharona." And you have a little bit of a PDF in your course materials. I want you to get that out. Pause the video if you need to. Get that PDF out, and you'll see at the top of it says "Study these scores: My Sharona versus Rapper's Delight." Um, and if you look at the rhythm, so you have a bass and drums. This is just a transcription of the opening bit of that song, "My Sharona." And if you look at the rhythm, this is rhythm, even though you haven't looked at, perhaps haven't read music in a couple years with the intent of being able to perform it. I bet you could still perform this rhythm, right? I'm gonna clap out the rhythm of the. You know what? I'll even do the bass rhythm, which is the slightly more complicated rhythm of those two. Here we go. We'll go slow and then we'll go up to tempo, right? The performance tempo is 144 beats per minute. We'll go a little under that first. Here we go. 1, 2, bass rhythm clap. 1 and 2 and 3, 4. 1, 2, 3 and 4, and 1 and 2 and 3, 4. 1, 2 and 3 and "My Sharona." That's where that comes in. Up to tempo. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, go. 1 and 2 and 3, 4. 1, 2, 3 and 4, and 1 and 2 and 3, 4. 1, 2 and 3 and. Now, that's not to say that every song in 1979 was that simple rhythmically, but that's about where the popular taste for rhythm was. And then you have "Rapper's Delight," and you have the opening verse. And what I do, I transcribe just the rhythm in there so that you can see. Now, even before I do it, you can already notice that there's a lot more complexity. The bass and drums going on underneath. The bass is from the name of it. The band is Le Chic. Dun, dun. It's killing me that I can't think of the name right now. I should have written this down in front of me. Anyway, so the bass line is a sample from a disco song, fairly recently, and that by itself is, there's a little bit of syncopation. For example, you get in that fourth measure, E and a 2 E and 3 4 E and a 2 E and. It skips beat one, goes on to that second 16th note. That's a little bit of syncopation right there. We're skipping the big beat and we're going for one of the lesser beats or the lesser counts within it. But then you look at the vocal rhythm, right? And all of a sudden, wow, the you can absolutely hear and see even how that's like a drum. So that idea that James Brown had about, treating all of his instruments like drums. Well, in this case, the advent of the of rapping over a track as opposed to singing over it, but with this type of rhythmic variation and complexity, there's all of a sudden this new dimension that was not really in popular music. So I'm gonna do this now. I'm not going to rap it, right? I'm not going to put that out there on YouTube. But what I will do is I'll put the counts to it, so you can hear that this is. And I want you to have listened to the song before. I'm zooming in on this a little bit so I can read a little bit better. I want you to listen to the song before you listen to me do this, so you just have a better appreciation of it. It might even be a little funnier. So this is 8 bars, and this is a quarter note equals 100. So it goes slower, but there's a lot more going in to each beat. So I'm going to start kind of singing the bass part, and then when I start counting, I'm going to be going into that second line. I said a hip hop when I'm getting into that part. Here we go. Bum, bum, bum. Da-da-dum, bum, 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 be-dum. These are backbeats. Bum, ba-dum, ba-doom, da-da-dum, dum. E and a 1, 2, a 3 E, a 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a E, a 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a E, a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a and 1, right? Now I just made it sound very square, but those rhythms are very transcribable and very locked in and pretty varied, right? So we have that sort of syncopation and rhythmic variety that starts to become infused in music. And so when you hear of, certain qualities in music that just to wrap things up here, the terms that we talked about, and like the contrast of those two types of music. And again, this is 40 years ago at this point, over 40 years ago. It's just interesting to know how much rhythm contributes towards the advancement of a musical style and the distinguishing of a musical style. So with that, I will see you guys in class, and be on the lookout for the supporting materials that I'm going to put along with this video. I will see you next time.